Hi, welcome back to Make Stuff Nation. This is part 7 of how to build a wooden Snipe class sailboat. Today I'm going to show you how to install the bronze bolts that hold the keel batten onto the floor timbers, which are part of the frames of the boat. Next, I'm going to scarf together 2 sheets of plywood for the bottom panels. Once we have the scarf joint complete, we'll take those patterns that we made in the last episode, trace out the panels on the sheet of plywood, and then cut them out. After that, we'll test fit them on the boat and trim them to final shape, and finally we'll install them using epoxy. Here's a diagram from the plans that show the bolts holding the keel batten onto the floor timbers. There's 2 bolts in each section, and the distance between the bolts is listed in this table. I've gone ahead and marked these out on the boat. The plans give you a little bit of flexibility on what type of bolts you're going to use. I'm using bronze 10-24 bolts, but you can also use 10-32 or even 1/4 inch. You can also use bronze or stainless, but bronze seems to be the more traditional way to go. For the install itself, I'm going to drill a small pilot hole, then I'll drill the countersink for the bolt head, and then finally I'll drill the rest of the hole through for the shaft of the bolt. These holes are going to be filled with epoxy, and then the keel sheet of plywood is going to go over it, so there's no need to put cotton in here to seal these. That's it for installing the keel bolts. I'll trim them to the proper length once I get it flipped upright. My next task is going to be scarfing together 2 sheets of plywood for the bottom panels. I'm going to set up a framework above the boat here to give me a working space to scarf those panels together because I don't really have any other room in the shop. What I did is I got some furring strips and cut them and attached them as uprights clamped to the frames of the boat. That gives me plenty of room to set my plywood on top to cut the scarf joints and then put them end to end to glue them together. When you're scarfing plywood or other pieces of wood together, you want the scarf joint to be 8 to 12 times the thickness of the piece of wood. This plywood is 9 millimeters thick, so my scarf joint is going to be 72 millimeters long. The best way to set up this scarf joint to cut the angles is to have a backer board that is flush with the end of one of your sheets of plywood, and then your next sheet of plywood you offset the width of the scarf joint. Then you mark back on the top sheet of plywood the width of the scarf joint. Once you have the joint laid out and the plywood clamped in place to the backer board, you can use a hand plane or a power plane, and you let the sole of the plane ride along the edges of the 2 boards. That's going to set the angle of the scarf joint. Then it's just a matter of planing down until you get an even line or edge all the way from the edge of this bottom panel back to the line you marked on the top panel. You want to make sure that each stroke of the plane covers both edges of the board. That way you're taking off an equal amount of wood off of each board for each stroke of the plane. As you plane the joint, you'll start to see the layers of the plywood be exposed. You know you're planing the scarf joint evenly if the layers of plywood expose themselves in parallel lines. If you have a wavering line, you're either planing too much off of one area or not enough off another. By the time you get planed back to the line you drew on the top panel, you should have even parallel lines across the whole width of the joint. It's important to have a good backer board underneath your bottom sheet of plywood because that supports the grain in the board and allows you to take it out to a feather edge. If you don't get the feather edge on both boards, when you flip it over and glue the joint in place, you'll end up with a lump in your scarf joint. You can see here that the layers of plywood are being exposed relatively parallel. But you can see here there's a little bit of an arc. It means I haven't taken off enough wood in this area. Also, you can see the unplaned areas should be progressing back at about the same rate. So you can see here I've taken more wood off this top panel than I have on the bottom panel. So I'm going to focus my attention here until I get this width the same as this width. You probably can't see it on camera, but if I look closely, I can see I have 3 layers of veneer left on the bottom board and about 2 3/4 to almost 3 layers left on the top board. So I know I'm getting close to that feather edge, but I still have a little ways to go. And now you can see up here, that problem spot I talked about earlier, I've got it planed back and it's now running pretty much parallel. You might be wondering why I'm not using my power plane to do all this work. It's a good question, but I found that I'm more likely to gouge out the panels in the scarf joint using my power plane than if I use the hand plane. It's more work, but I get a much smoother finish, and it's much more easy for me to control what's going on with the hand plane. So here's the finished scarf joint cut on the 2 sheets of plywood. You can see we have a nice straight edge from the feather edge on the bottom panel up to I've just planed off the line that we've drawn on the top panel. This is where the 2 boards overlap. You can see we have a feather edge on the top board. All the layers of the plywood are exposed essentially parallel, so that means we have a nice even joint all the way down the width of the boards. Now I'm going to get the panels set in position, ready to glue up. So below the panels I have a piece of plywood that's covered with packing tape. That'll prevent any squeeze out epoxy from sticking to it. I've got a second piece of plywood covered with packing tape that'll go on top of the joint. Also below that support piece of plywood I have a 2x4, and above it, on top of this sheet of plywood, I'm going to put this block in the middle, this 2x4 on top, and clamp it at either side. That's going to apply clamping pressure to the joint in the middle of the sheet of plywood, since I don't have any clamps with a long enough reach to get to the middle. With everything ready to go, it's time to mix up some epoxy. Here's the scarf joint all glued up. I'm very happy with how it's going. Looking at it from the side, all the layers are matching up very nicely, and I used my straight edge to align the length of the panel, so everything should be straight and square. The clamping system works pretty well. I'm getting a decent amount of clamping force at the center of the panel and along the edges. The 2 plywood pieces that it's sandwiched between really help to distribute those clamping forces. There will definitely be a little bit of squeeze out I'm going to need to clean up, but I'll take care of all that when I finish the exterior of the boat. Hey Alan, what's up? Are you going to help in the shop today? The epoxy on the scarf joint is cured for 24 hours, so let's take off the clamps and see how it turned out. This scarf joint turned out really nice. There's no lumps or unevenness along the sheet of plywood. I'm going to trim off this squeeze out with a hand plane, and then we'll be ready to take our patterns for the bottom panels and trace them onto this sheet of plywood. Well, there you have it. I've got the 2 bottom panels roughed out. Next, I need to remove this temporary work table off the framework of the boat. What's up, Alan? What do you think? Is it time to fit these bottom panels? Get them glued on? Not sure, huh? I've gone ahead and finished fitting the starboard bottom panel off camera, and now I'll show you how I did that whole process using the port side bottom panel. First step is just to gently set the bottom panel in place, and then I'm going to put in one attachment to keep it from sliding off while I fine-tune its position. Once I have it in position, I'm going to go and use screws and washers to fasten it into place, and then I can trim the edges to their final dimensions. I'm going to use solely screws and washers to attach this bottom panel, or rather clamp it in place while I'm fitting it and while I'm gluing it, because I don't have any clamps that will reach around the sides and transom. Are you going to help me lift this bottom panel, or are you just going to stand there in front of the heater? Alright, I'll do it myself. So I should have approximately a 1/4 inch of overlap all the way around the outside of the panel, which I'm going to trim down to final dimensions. To make sure I have the panel fit in place, I'm going to position this corner with a 1/4 inch of overlap on either side of the side panel and the transom here. I'll put in my one fastener, and then I can adjust the front of the panel to make sure I have everything fit in the right spot. You're just such a big help, Alan. How do you like your bed there? Staying toasty? Positioning the front of the panel, I'm just checking to make sure that I have enough overlap on either side up at the keel and then down where the bottom panel is going to miter up against the side panel. This looks pretty good. That's enough fasteners to secure the bottom panel for the moment. My next step is going to be taking a block plane and trimming down this bottom panel so it's flush with the side panel and the transom. I'm going to get that done all the way up to frame 2. Once that's complete, I'll add some more fasteners up forward of the boat and start trimming in the front of the panel. I'm taking this down pretty much flush to the transom. I'm not going all the way, because I'll finish the last little bit with sanding after we've glued the panel onto the bottom. With this pretty much flush, now I'm going to do the same thing to this joint on the side of the boat. I think this blade's about had it. Time for a sharpen. That has the bottom panel fared in with the side panel, pretty much the length of the boat, at least where the bottom panel overlaps the side panel. Now we're up to this point, which is 10 inches forward of station 1, where the bottom panel is going to miter in with the side panel. To get this fit, it's mainly trial and error. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to use a chisel to start the miter here, and then once I can get room for a hand plane, I'll come in with a hand plane and try to set that angle. Basically, I'll plane a little bit off, bend the panel in, check the fit, and then plane off more as necessary until I get a nice seam all the way to the stem of the boat. As I work my way forward, I'll add in more screws to hold it in place. I've got an acceptable fit up to about here. Now I just need to keep working my way forward to the stem. Essentially, I lift it up, plane off a bit, and then press it down and see where it's interfering with the side panel. Then I just lift it up, trim off a little bit more there, and try again. What do you think, Alan? How's our progress? Are you bored out of your mind? You want to go outside? All right, go out and enjoy the nice day. I think it's time for some more screws and washers. Hey Alan, I'm all out of fender washers. You want to go to the store and get me some? Where are we going, Alan? Are we going to the store? Are you psyched? Are you excited? You gonna lead the way? Come on. Alan, those are bolts. We need fender washers. There you go. Now you found them. Here we go. These should work. 3/16 by 1 1/4. What next, Alan? Some screws? There we go. That's stuff. Number 8, 1 1/4. Hey, come on, Alan. We got our stuff. We got to get going. Come on, big guy, in the truck. All the way over. There you go. That has it secure. Now I just need to put screws in along the top. Now that I have this bottom panel roughed in and attached in place, I can finish trimming the panel up at the stem, where the stem cap is going to cover it. And then I also need to plane this to a 90-degree angle to the keel batten, so that when I cut the keel out of plywood, it'll fit in nice and snug. This joint here is where the stem cap is going to end and the plywood keel is going to start. That's good enough for now. I'll fine tune this once we have the panels epoxied in place and have removed all the screws and washers. What I need to do is plane down this side panel until it meets this line where the angle of the bottom panel meets the flat of the keel batten. I've already done that on the starboard side panel, and to accomplish it, I just laid a rabbet plane on its side. That sets the blade 90 degrees to the keel batten, and then just planed down until I can see the line that we drew earlier. This keel batten is going to be 102 millimeters wide per the Snipe class standards. So I'll just check our measurements as we go. Got about 3 millimeters to go here. Got about 4 or 5 millimeters to go back here at the transom. The keel runs a full width of 102 millimeters all the way up to station 2. Then it starts to taper down until where it meets the stem cap. As I move forward and get into that taper, my rabbet plane is too wide to fit in this channel. So what I'm going to need to do is remove this panel, which is already done, so I can finish planing this port side panel. That looks pretty good for this joint for the keel. So now I can take this panel off, clean up all the sawdust, and we'll be ready to epoxy both bottom panels into place. I have the panels staged and ready to go. So now it's time to mix up epoxy, and then we're gonna put the port panel on first, get that all screwed down, and then we'll install the starboard panel. That's it for attaching this panel. Now we're going to mix up another batch of epoxy and install the starboard side. Now that we have both of the bottom panels epoxied and screwed down, I'm cleaning up any drippage or squeeze out on the inside of the boat. This will make finishing the inside of the boat much easier later on. It's the next day and the epoxy is mostly cured. I'm going to wait to remove any screws though until it's cured for a full 24 hours. These panels are under a lot of tension and I want to make sure it's reached maximum strength. In the meantime, I'm going to start prepping the plywood that's going to complete the keel. This is the scrap piece from the panel that we cut the sides of the boat out of. It's more than long enough for our keel, and thankfully it still has one factory edge. So that's gonna make it easy to rip to rough width. So this is the keel piece and where it's going to lie in place. Again, I cut it slightly oversized, so now I'll use a hand plane to trim it down to final dimension. And obviously up here at the front of the taper, I'm going to need to take off quite a bit. But it was fastest to rip it on the table saw to get it to rough width. I've got a good fit on the keel, so after I remove the screws and patterns off the side panels, I can take the keel off, clean it out, make sure all those epoxy joints are clean, and then we'll epoxy the keel in place. Well, that wraps up epoxying the keel in place. I'm going to let it cure for 24 hours and then I'll remove the clamping screws. With the keel installed in its final position, that wraps up the major exterior construction for the boat in this configuration on the jig. The last things I need to do before I flip it upright and start working on the deckwork and the interior of the boat is cutting the daggerboard slot and adding the stem cap up at the front. This is where we're going to wrap up today's video. In the next video, we'll get to work adding that stem cap on the front of the boat, cutting this daggerboard slot, and we'll even start building the daggerboard case. I hope you found this video entertaining and useful. If you have any questions or suggestions, please leave them in the comments down below. I read all of the comments and I try to respond to many of them. If you'd like to see updates between these videos, you can follow me on Instagram at MakeStuffNation, on Twitter, and also on Facebook. If you're wondering about any of the materials, tools, or even camera equipment that I use, I have Amazon associate links for some of that equipment down in the description. Thanks for watching Make Stuff Nation. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.